Greetings and welcome to Lesson 7. In this lesson we will create a simple game I call the Millisecond app. A millisecond is 1,000th of a second, or in other words, there's 1,000 milliseconds in every second. In games, many of the activities and events happen at this time scale. The Millisecond app gives you a chance to test your own reaction time in milliseconds while giving you a better feeling for this time scale. This lesson will introduce you to the use of clocks, as well as the concept of states and the user interface component sliders. I'm going to begin by setting the orientation of screen 1 to portrait. And next, I'm going to pull a label over onto the screen. This label is going to serve as my instructions. I'll make it bold and increase the font size to 20. And I'm going to change the text to read, "Tap when you see the target." Next, I will pull over a horizontal arrangement. I'm going to use the horizontal arrangement a little differently from what I've done in other apps. Here it is going to be used to center my target. So for that, I want to set the alignment horizontal to center. I'm going to make the height 50 pixels. And I'm going to make the width fill parent. Now for my target. If you have not already done so, you should download an image of a target or some image that will serve as a target. I'm going to go to User Interface and bring a button over and drop it into my horizontal arrangement, and it should show up right in the center. Next, I'm going to upload my image, or at least choose my image, which I've already uploaded. I need to get rid of the text. I need to set the size of the image so that it is 50 by 50. And obviously at this point I'm actually changing the size of the button, but it effectively changes the size of my image. There is one last aspect about this button. Most of the time it will be a non-visible component. It will be there, the user just will not be able to see it. And the way the game will work is the button will appear, and that is when the user will tap it as quickly as they can. So we need to make this a non-visible component. We go down to where it says visible, we uncheck that, and as soon as we do that, we notice that the button no longer appears on the screen. Once again, it's still there, it's just that we will not be able to see it. And there's one last thing before I move on. Let's rename this button our target button. In this game, the player will have an allotted period of time to hit the target after it appears. And if they do hit the target, then we want to provide them feedback that they have done so. To do this, let's pull over another horizontal arrangement. With this one, we're going to set both the horizontal and the vertical to center because we want our hit label to show up in the middle. For our height, let's set it to 200 pixels. And for our width, let's set it to fill parent. Now, let's go to user interface and get a label, which we will pull over, and that is going to serve as our feedback. I'll rename this my feedback label. I'm going to make it bold font. I'm going to make it huge, 35 font. And I'm going to take away the text because there should not be anything showing up in this label until we actually want to give our user feedback. You can think of the last two horizontal arrangements that we added as the play area for the game. Let's add another horizontal arrangement, and this one will have a button, and the way it works is when the player taps this button, it will tell the app that they're ready to begin a round of the game. So once we get our horizontal arrangement over, let's set the align horizontal to center. Let's set the width to fill parent, so it goes all the way across. And now let's pull a button over, drop it in that horizontal arrangement, and on the button we will change the text to begin. Then lastly, let's rename our button, and this will be our begin button. At the bottom of the screen, we're going to have a slider, and a player will adjust that slider and change the number of milliseconds that they're allowed to try and hit the target in a round. We need to have two labels that appear above that slider. So let's pull over another horizontal arrangement. Set the horizontal alignment to center. Pull over one label, and this will be my millisecond label. In that label, we will set the height to 40. Let's go back up and make it bold. And we will change the text to milliseconds. Now, next to that label, we'll add a second label that will serve as a spacer. And a third label and this will be our time label. So this will be an amount of time that you have for a given round. We will change the text to bold, and it will start out when the game first begins as 500. Now let's go and adjust our spacer. We need to get rid of the text. And I will say a width of about 40 pixels will give us a good layout. Finally, for the designer screen, we'll pull over a slider and put it at the bottom. And let's set the width of our slider to fill parent so it goes all the way across the screen. We want the max value to be 1000. And we'll leave the min value at 10 because we don't want to allow a user to take it to 0. And we'll set the thumb position to 500 so that when it first starts, the slider will appear in the middle of the screen. One note is with the viewer, the slider is not going to look right, but look at the phone and it should look okay. And the very last step is, let's go to media. And let's make that sensors. And we need a clock because we are going to be using timing in this app. With this app, I want to introduce the concept of a state. At different points in time, an app or a game may be in different states. For instance, with this game, we'll have two states. The first state will be the one where the target is visible, and the other state will be the period in which the target is not visible. We are going to need a variable to keep track of the state of the game. So let's go to variables, do initialize global. We want to change the name of our variable and we will call it state. Now let's go to math and get a number block. And we're going to start the game with the state set to 1, which is the condition where the target is not visible. Next, let's program our slider. So for the slider, we want the block that says when the position is changed. And what we want to do is, if you recall, we had the label that showed the current position of the slider. We want to change that number as a player moves the slider back and forth. So for our time label, let's get the set text to. It's going to be a number, and we want to have it be a round number, so it's a whole number. So under math, let's get the block that says round. And then lastly, go to our slider, and let's get the value of the thumb position on the slider. Slider thumb position. This is a get block. Plug that in. And so what it's now going to do is it's going to look at the thumb position on the slider, which a user can move back and forth, take that number, round it off to a whole number, and display it above the slider. Let's next program the begin button. The way we want this to work is that when a player taps the begin button, it starts a new trial. So the first thing that happens is if the target is still visible from the last trial, then we should make that target non-visible. So let's go to the begin button and we will get the when click event handler. And next thing we want to do is this variable state. We want to change that to 1, or at the least we want to make sure it's 1. So under variables we'll get a set block. We'll specify that the variable is state, and then we will change it to 1. So let's just do this. We'll copy and paste this. Come on. Okay. Now the next thing we want to do is to start a timer. So we will go to our clock and we want to go to the bottom and get the set time interval. And what this block will do is specify how long the clock should run. We don't want to give it a fixed number that will be the same from each trial to another. We want it to vary, because if it's the same number each trial, then the player will be able to anticipate and predict when the target's going to appear. So let's go to math, and we will get the random integer block. And then let's set this so that the random integer will be between 1,000 milliseconds and 3,000 milliseconds. So now that we've set the interval for how long the timer will run, we need to turn the timer on. We'll go to clock, and we'll get the green block that is set timer enabled. This is the block that will turn on the clock. But to turn it on, we're going to need a logic block. So at the top we go to logic, the green blocks, and we grab a true. So this says that it is true that the clock is enabled. One last thing we need to do, we have a label for feedback. That's the big label that goes in the middle that provides feedback. let's set the text for that label to empty or nothing. And what this does is it assures that for the interval between the start of the trial and when the player hits the target, there's no text showing up in the feedback label. We need to tell the program what to do when a player hits the target within the allotted time. For that, remember our target is actually a button, so we will get a when-click event handler for that button. Now for our feedback label, we'll get the set text block. And when the player gets the target in the time, we want it to show hit. So HIT. Next, let's work on what should happen when the timer times out before a player is able to hit the target. So we go to clock, and there's an event handler, when clock1.timer. Let's grab that event handler. Here we're going to need to use a if-then block. That was going to be under control. We pull the if-then block over, and we're going to want to add an else condition. And we tap on the blue dot, and there we see the else. We'll pull an else over and plug it in. And now you see it adds that condition to our if-then block. So we have a block that says, if this condition exists, we do this, and if it doesn't exist, we do this other thing. The condition that we're interested in is when the state variable equals 1. So this would correspond to two situations. One being a player is between trials. They finish one trial and have not hit the begin button for the next trial. And the other condition is after they hit the begin button and prior to the target appearing. So that would be that interval we created for our random onset. We'll go to math and we'll get a comparison block. Plug that into the if. Now for variables, we'll do a get. And make this our state variable. And we'll get a number 1 to go in here. When the timer times out and the state variable's 1, for the then, there'll be 4 things that we need to do. The first of these is to change the state variable itself. So we will do a set and make our state variable value 0. Next, we want to start the timer again. And in this case, we will first set the interval to our thumb position on the slider. So, set the timer interval. We go to our slider, and we get the thumb position. So remember, this is where the player sets what the millisecond time should be for how long the target appears. Next, let's make our target visible. So for our target, we will get set visible. And we will use a logical true block here. Now let's turn on the timer so that our target is visible for the specified duration. We will go to clock, get time enabled, and let's set that to true also. We have one last thing to do, and that is to specify the else. And this is going to be very simple. All we want to do is, for our target, we want to change the visibility so that it is no longer visible. So we will say set visible, and we will put a logical false. If you have not already done so, here's your chance to take a few minutes to experiment with the Millisecond app. And as you're doing so, think of ideas for how you can modify this app or create your own version of the app that illustrates other aspects of the millisecond timescale. This might involve other human activities that occur on a millisecond timescale, such as the activities that occur in games or in sports, or it could be physical phenomena, such as the time it takes for a signal to travel from Earth to a satellite and back. Whatever you choose, here's a chance to apply your creativity to come up with a unique demonstration of what can happen in the millisecond timescale. For more lessons, or the written instructions to go with this lesson, visit the Brain Hackers website at www.brainhackers.net.